We continue our examination of the pathway of excellence. There's not one of us here who would want to have it advertised on their cars. At least I don't think you would. Striving for mediocrity. I don't think anybody would do that. Now, we may end up doing it. We may satisfy ourselves at times with mediocrity, but you don't run around saying, look at me, all I want to be is mediocre. Because the truth of the matter is, it's easy to get there. Don't have to do a lot. But in fact, we want to strive for excellence. That is why we take the pathway that we do. It is because of the grace of God that we even have a pathway of excellence. 2 Peter opens his letter in chapter 1 and in verse 3 saying that God has given us all things that pertain to life and godliness. It is because of God that we have the pathway to walk upon. Paul, I think, put it best in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 10 when he said, by the grace of God I am what I am. There is no doubt but that all that we are and all that we have comes to us by the grace of God. As we continue our study on the pathway of excellence, we come to this passage where Paul instructed the Corinthians, see that you abound in this grace also. Now, the word grace suffers, unfortunately, from some bad understandings in the religious world. Grace is used 155 times in the New Testament, and it means that which bestows well-being to people. The Bible uses it 190 times or more in the Old Testament. And there the word refers to a situation where one who is stronger comes to the aid of one who is weaker because that weaker being needs them. The stronger notices the need and is willing to come to the aid. That's what grace is in the Old Testament. And I believe when you put them together, Paul wants us to do that, I think, in Romans chapter 15, verse 4. What things were written before were written for our learning, that we through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. We put those together and here's what we find. A stronger coming to the aid of a weaker person or a being because that person needs it. And the stronger one notices it and comes in order to establish well-being in that person's life. Now, that's what grace is. Now notice, Paul said to the Corinthian brethren, I want you to abound in this grace also. The context, again, to remind us, Paul is collecting money for the famine time in the Judea area. And he is going around collecting this money, and he's already come across some people, the beginning of this chapter, who didn't have anything but wanted to give anyway. And Paul is using them as an example to others who do have physical means. And he says, take them as an example, and you do what they do. You have the physical ability to do it that they did not have. And he said, therefore, abound in this grace. What? The grace of giving the stronger to the weaker, because they need it to provide well-being in their situation. Abound in this grace also. As everyone else is involved, you be as well. So the question comes, what is excellent grace. How do we excel in grace? What is it that Paul is saying to the Corinthians? Abound or excel in this grace also. There are a few things that I want us to consider this morning that relate to abounding or excelling in the grace of God. The first thing I want us to notice is that those of us who are on the pathway of excellence should be able to look at ourselves and say this: I expect to find the grace of God. In Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 16. After identifying Jesus as the high priest who has sacrificed himself, knows us by having been here, being tempted like as we are, yet without sin, he says this: therefore, let us come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Those on the pathway of excellence expect to find the grace of God. Those who expect to find it search for it. Where then, in any situation that we find ourselves, we should ask, where here is the grace of God? Where can I look to find the grace of God? I should search for it. The grace of God has never been presented in its form of salvation, never been presented as just sit back and it'll hit you in the face one day. Never. Now, there is a way in which we sit back and enjoy the grace of God, but that is not connected to salvation. The mere fact that the sun came up today, grace of God. The mere fact that we have food to eat, the grace of God. And we could mention a number of those kinds of things. Those are by the grace of God. And a lot of people, maybe everybody, just sort of sits back and enjoys that. In fact, so many people experience it and never one time even think about the grace of God. But everything that is connected to faithfulness and salvation, God says we have to search for it. Let us come boldly there. I expect to find it when I get there. I know it is there. God has said, I offer you my grace, and I expect to find it because He has promised me that when I come there, I will. And everyone on the pathway of excellence who's wanting to find grace in the time of need approaches God in prayer, looking for it, because we expect to find it. Now, we don't expect to find our will in that moment. We expect to find His. But we approach that moment with our will laid out there. It's okay for us to say, God, this is what I want, leaving it to Him to do with it as He will. I expect to find the grace of God, not in what I want, but in what I get, because that's how God operates. The first thing I know about excellent grace is that if I am on that pathway of excellence, I should expect to find it. Number two, anybody who is on the pathway of excellence should be established in it. Should be established in it. You can look at Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 9, and there you find it. The writer says, "Do not be carried about with strange and various doctrines, for it is good that the heart be established by grace, and not with foods which have not profited those who have been occupied by them." God says, establish your heart in grace. Well, that fits what he's saying. Go search for it, and when you find it, establish yourself in it. Let it be that which is the foundation and the stability of your life, the grace of God. Notice what he says about that. Number one, be true to truth. The grace of God is not found in the false teachings of men. The grace of God will not be found in the strange doctrines that God's Word does not teach. The context of the book of Hebrews is important for this point. Hebrews, by its title, means that it was written to Jewish Christians. What was the problem? The problem was they had lived their lives under the old covenant. Then they obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ. And after a period of time, for whatever reason, they began to leave the new covenant and go back, at least in some ways, to the previous covenant. And these people, he said, you're going after strange doctrines. This is not what Jesus taught. This was a constant theme in the early church, especially in the ministry of Paul. In fact, there were people who followed him around from town to town, trying to undermine his preaching by saying, oh, wait a minute, Paul's not giving you the full truth. The full truth also includes these things from the old covenant that you have to keep in the new. Paul, the writer of Hebrews, says that's a strange doctrine. To establish ourselves in grace, we need to make sure we are true to truth. But number two, we need to make sure we don't major in minors. The point of mentioning foods was this. Yes, the old law was filled with a bunch of regulations. Do this, don't do this, over and over and over. Those regulations became for the people led by their leaders as the definition of faithfulness. Here's the definition. Get up in the morning, don't eat that food, and you get one mark in your favor. During the day, do these things and you get a mark every time you do them. And at the end of the day, at the end of the week, at the end of the year, you pull out your sheet and you look at all the marks and you say, look at us. We're holy before God. They were majoring on minors. Sure, God said don't eat certain things, but that was for health reasons. Yes, it was a command from God. But at the same time, He did not want them to identify their faithfulness by what foods they did or did not eat. He wanted them to identify their faithfulness by saying, I want to serve the Lord. People who major in minors are not looking for the grace of God. They're looking to define their own grace that they try to put on somebody else. And that, my brethren, is not God's grace. We need to be established in His grace. The third thing we need to understand is how to excel in grace. How do we do that? How does somebody abound in grace? Well, obviously, we follow the Lord's leading in that. So what does he say when he tells the Corinthians, abound in this grace? Yes, he's saying abound in this grace of giving also. Did you see that? I'm not sure he's talking necessarily about everybody else is giving money, so you do it also. I think he may be saying, you have the grace of God in so many areas, abound in this one also. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, as Paul does in almost all of his letters, he opens and says, the grace of God which you have. There's no doubt that the Corinthian brethren were under the grace of God. Notice 2 Corinthians 9 verse 14. There he called it abundant grace, excellent grace. In other words, these brethren had not just experienced the grace of God, they had it abundantly themselves. Right in the context of chapter 8, you can see that contrast. Here are the people from Macedonia who didn't have anything. But you have the people in Corinth who seemed to have everything. They were still in the grace of God, even though they didn't have much physically. They searched for it, they found the grace of God in their poverty by being able to give to those in need. Certainly in Corinth, they should do it. Certainly in this rich environment, you should do it. But it also seems that they had an abundance of grace from God. They understood what it means to have been given grace from God. So to be excellent in grace, I need to appreciate the grace that God has given me. We are blessed people. We have so much. Anyone, and I've done it twice, and that's all. Ben and others have been many more times. You go to most any other country outside of this one, and you find that we really do have it made. Shouldn't we, like Corinth, abound in the grace of God because we have it so much? Number two, let us abound in the grace of God as we value the grace that we have, as we understand its real value. In Romans 3, 24 and 25, we find out that the real value of grace is this, that Jesus came from heaven and died for you and me. That was the price paid for the grace of God. And it's not a price that he paid and then went back to heaven never to pay it again. It's not like he gave up something temporarily for a little while only to get it back. Not much of a sacrifice there. That's why I believe his sacrifice in some way is eternal. And I honestly believe the possibility is that someday when we are all in heaven, we will see Jesus again leave his place with the Father and come down amongst us and associate with us for eternity. Now that's an eternal sacrifice. That's the real value of the sacrifice of Jesus. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 28 teaches that concept. That the Father might be all in all. Jesus did that, will do that for us. Third, let us stand firmly in the grace of God. Romans chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, that's what he says. Stand in this grace in which you stand. If we are on the pathway of excellence, we must not constantly be vacillating back and forth in the grace of God, out of the grace of God. What does that mean? Well, the grace of God operates in behalf of those who are His people for salvation purposes. And therefore, if I'm standing in the grace of God, I'm not constantly living in the world and then coming back over here, going back to the world and coming back over here. There has to be a way in which I find a foundation and a stance where I can stay strong in the grace of God. Constantly vacillating back and forth between the things that this world offers and the things that God expects while we're tempted and we fail. I dare not be living here and then living here, constantly back and forth. Let us stand. If you're in the pathway of excellence, you excel in grace when you find a way to stand faithfully with God. If you are constantly in pain and turmoil and tension with respect to the things of God, maybe you haven't found a way to stand. On the pathway of excellence, we know that excellence, or that grace that is dormant, is not grace at all. In 2 Corinthians 9 in verse 8, Paul told those brethren that they should be looking for these good works that demonstrate the grace they have. If I'm excelling in grace, if I'm trying to have excellent grace, then I want to do the things that show I have the grace of God. I'm not showing it to anybody else. I like Josh's reference in the text today for the Lord's Supper. Certainly by the grace of God, the sacrifice of Jesus is for us, and we partake of the Lord's Supper in its memory. And yes, we do it together so we see each other, but it's not about me showing off. It's about my obedience, submission to God. And that's exactly what we do in our good works. They're not for the purpose of show, but they do in fact show that I value the grace of God. And as Paul said, I am what I am because of Him. And if I value God's grace, and if I'm looking for God's grace, then I know that it cannot be dormant. And it is the good works that show that I have the grace of God in my life. Not for the works themselves, but rather for the fact that I can serve God through them and return to Him what He has given to me. The final passage is 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 15. This is where we put it together for all of us. All things are for your sakes, that grace, having spread through the many, may cause thanksgiving to abound to the glory of God. Those of us on the pathway of excellence understand the best way to incubate the grace of God is with everyone who is in the grace of God. In fact, part of what we do in our worship assembly is to encourage and strengthen and build up each other so that we can go out and be more in the grace of God. That's the point. It is our common acceptance of the grace of God that causes us to leave this place when the group may not be available and live in the grace of God. That's one of the powers to our assembly. Because it's through the many that the grace of God really takes off. Because we leave here and in our own little worlds, we show the grace of God to those around us. It very well may be that the brethren in Corinth never met the brethren in Judea. Might be. But everybody there saw the grace of God operating in their lives through what they did on their behalf. Based on the concept of grace, the world is weak. And the people of God are strong because we have the grace of God. That's why Jesus sent us out. It's the stronger going to the weaker because they need it for their well-being. Let us congregationally and individually abound, excel in the grace of God, because that's how God's message spreads. It came from Him, through us, to those who need it. Let us all be thankful that the grace of God was shared with us by somebody. Parent, friend, church member, neighbor. If you are in the grace of God, somebody shared it with you. That's a fact. Let us be grateful for someone who did. But if you've been shared the grace of God but never accepted it, that's also grace. You have to accept it. He doesn't force it on you. Today, if you're outside of Jesus, the grace of God's been shared with you. But if you have not accepted it, today would be a great day to obey your Lord, to be immersed with Him in baptism. Or maybe we can help you live the life of grace better. Can we help you today? If you'll let us know while we stand and sing together.